Welcome to our latest video, featuring one of Jordan Peterson's most insightful moments. We've gone the extra mile with some special editing to enhance your viewing experience. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this.
Say you have a particular emotional response to something. Maybe it's a negative emotional response. And you see this very frequently with arguments with people. You're having an argument with someone you love, like a family member. That's a good example. So let's say it's the same damn fight you've had with your mother 50 times. Okay, well, that's interesting, because what it means is that all of those 50 times that you fought with your mother are implicit in this fight. So although it's taking place right here and now, the past has shaped it. And if you wanted to investigate the fight completely, you'd have to get to the bottom of that entire train of interactions you'd had with your mother. So it's implicit in your current experience. That's one way of thinking about it. But the future's implicit in it too, because what you're doing right now, it's as if the future's folded up in what you're experiencing right now, and it unfolds as you interact with it. And so, and the reason that it's conditional to some degree on you and your past is because it's your past and you that are determining the actions that you undertake right now that determine how the future is going to unfold around you. Now, not completely, obviously, because you don't have complete control over how things unfold, but you seem to have some ability to determine how things unfold. So one of the ways I've sort of conceptualized the phenomenological viewpoint, this is one way of thinking about it, I believe, is that instead of thinking, and it does mean you have to reconceptualize your idea of objects. Like an object seems like a unidimensional thing in some sense. It's an object. But most of the things that people interact with aren't like that at all. So, like, here's an example. Let's say you have, let's say you get you're writing the MCAT. You want to go to medical school. You've written the MCAT. You get the envelope in the mail. It tells you what your score is. You hold the envelope. What are you holding? Well, if you think about it from an objective perspective, it's an envelope. Who cares? It's just a little piece of paper, right? It's a rectangle of paper. But that isn't what you're holding at all. That's not what that thing is. That's how you see it, but it's not what it is at all. It's not even, and you know that. Your body knows that because you're shaking. It's like, well, what are you scared of? The envelope? Well, the fact that you see it as an envelope is only an indication of just how narrow your perceptions actually are. Because it's a portal, right? It's a portal through which you're going to walk into one of two worlds, one in which you're in medical school and the other in which you're not. And it also actually contains the past, which is really strange, because you think, well, you already know what the past is. It's no, you don't. Whatever that score is in there determines what your past was. And you know that too. You go watch a movie and a bunch of things happen in the movie, and then something twisted happens at the end, and all of a sudden everything that you thought about the movie was wrong, and a whole new past for the movie pops into being. Well, are you a pre-med student, a valid pre-med student? Well, the score will determine whether or not you were. Very strange, because you think of the past as fixed, and you think of the things that you're interacting with as the things that you see, and they're not. And your body is smarter than that, way smarter than that, because it responds to, you could say, this is sort of a Rogerian perspective, your body is more likely to respond to what the thing actually is than how it is that you see it. So, okay, so the past is implicit in the current being, and the future is implicit in the current being. And so the past and the future sort of folded up inside it, and you can unfold them and take a look at them. Now, here's the next thing. So, from a classic scientific perspective, there's the world of independently existing objects, and there's the world of subjects. And the subject is really in a secondary relationship to the object, because the objective world is what's real. But one of the things that the phenomenologists were concerned about that is that, well, you run into this problem again of exactly how it is that you define the object, because just as the envelope with the scores in it can't be reduced to the paper, so the object that you're interacting with only reveals what it is as a consequence of the way that you interact with it. So, for example, if you take a complex object like another person, it's like, well, what is it that you are? Well, a huge part of that is going to depend on exactly how I interact with you. because you could be a raging beast if I interacted with you one way, and you could be a perfectly, cooperative entity that was very pleasant if I interacted with you the other way, and another way. And so partly what's happening, you could think of what you're interacting with as something that's really multifaceted, truly multifaceted. And you say, well, you're trying to determine what it is, but the problem is that what it is manifests itself only in accordance with how you behave towards it. And it's actually the case with even objects that you reduce right down to their constituent elements. So you might say, like, let's talk about subatomic particles, hypothetically the most objective thing there is. Well, it turns out that whether they're a wave or a particle depends on the way you set up the experiment. Now, I don't want to make quantum analogies, but what I'm saying is that the object is a very, very complicated thing. And so even defining what it is means that you have to adopt a frame of reference with regards to it, and you undertake only some procedures and not others. So when you're defining an object, even scientifically, you actually don't define the object. What you say is, here's a multidimensional entity. If you approach it in this manner, that's the procedure, right? The methods. If you approach it in this manner, it will manifest that set of traits. But the problem is that there's all sorts of other traits that it could manifest just as well if you treated it a different way. And so the object itself is not something that, it's not something easily reducible to a single set of properties. I was talking to one of my students yesterday. He had a pretty smart thing to say about images. We were talking about deep images, the sorts that you might see in a really high quality museum. So maybe they're, 15th century or 16th century Renaissance masterpieces. They're inexhaustible to some degree, which is why they're in museums and people go look at them, decade after decade. And it's partly because every time you look at them, you're different. You go in one week, you look at it, you see something. You go in the next week, you look at it, you see something else. Well, it's partly because you're bringing something entirely different to the situation. And the image is complicated enough to allow it to reflect something new to you, depending on the stance you take in relationship to it. And lots of things are like that. Lots of things are like that. A book you read when you were 16 is going to be an entirely different book when you read it when you're 35. You say, well, the book's the same. It's like, it depends on how you define the book, because it isn't even obvious where the book is exactly. Well, it's on my shelf in the library. It's like, no, that's a chunk of paper that's on your shelf in the library. Where exactly the book is, that's a much more difficult question to consider. So it depends on how you define the book. So without a subject, nothing at all would exist to confront objects and to imagine them as such. True, this implies that every object, everything objective, in being merely objectified by the subject is the most subjective thing possible. Well, you also know this again when you're in an argument with someone. It's you. No, it's you. No, it's you. It's like, you don't know. Are you being biased? Are you looking at the situation incorrectly? The person you're arguing with is going to convince you that trying to convince you that it's your problem. You think, no, you made me angry. It's like, an interesting statement, as if you could do that, but it does seem that way. You were being provocative. Well, you're just too sensitive. It's like, how are we going to settle that? Well, it's a continual argument, and that again has to do with the crazy entangled dynamic between subjective perception and objective perception. I've showed you this before, and I actually think this is a pretty good schematic representation of what's meant by Dasein. And this is a complicated little diagram, although the diagram itself is quite simple, but it's predicated on the following assumptions, is that you need to narrow down your world. And what you're doing is narrowing it down from, let's say, an infinite set of possibilities to a finite set of manageable possibilities. And you do that a bunch of ways. Partly merely your senses aren't acute enough to detect everything. So pure stupidity, in some sense, stops you from being absolutely overwhelmed. You don't have eyes in the back of your head, for example, so you don't have to worry about all those things you're not looking at behind you. But then it's far more than that. You just can't handle that full complexity, so there's a continual narrowing process. And then you exist inside that narrowed reality. Like if I look at you like that, there's not a hell of a lot of difference between that and looking at you like that. Like I can't really see these people. I can tell they're people, that's all. I can see your face. I've got just about all of it right there. So That's a very narrow, and you're moving your eyes around and inhabiting this constant narrow space. Well, what's that space? What does that space you inhabit consist of? Well, that's Dasein, that space that you inhabit. And so we could say it's something like this. You have implicit in that perception a sense of where you are and what you're doing right now. It's in the perception. And then in the perception as well is what you're aiming at. Because you're not just sitting here passively, or you'd be asleep, or you'd be unconscious. You're sitting here doing nothing, physically, but you have an aim in mind, and the aim is what you're pointing your eyes at. The aim is what's structuring your perceptions. The aim is what's revealing that part of the world that is being revealed to you. That's the revelation of the world. It also structures your emotions. It also primes your behaviors. So it's not a drive, it's not a goal, it's not a motivation. It's more than that. It's all of that at once. That's sort of what your personality is. But you see, the phenomenologists don't really think about personality. They think about the manifestation of your reality. It's not exactly your personality. It's that you're the center of a reality. And you constitute that reality. But all your elements of experience constitute that reality. And so it's something like, its simplest element is something like where you are, where you're going, and the embodied actions you undertake to relate those two things, which would include your eye movements, because of course, perception is an active phenomena. You are shaking your eyes back and forth unbelievably rapidly. Otherwise, if you can make your eyes stand still, which you can do with great concentration, everything will black out. Because you have to move your eyes back and forth so that the light hits different cells, because the cells get exhausted and then they stop reporting. So you're just whipping your eyes back and forth in a micro way constantly, and as well as moving them around voluntarily and involuntarily. So even perception is a lot more like feeling things out with your fingers, even when you're using your ears or your eyes. It's very active. There's no passive perception. It's a motor act to perceive. And so that motor act is determined by your hierarchy of values. That's one way of looking at it. So another way of thinking about it, that's also how the past and the future are implicit in it. Your very active perception is determined by your entire value structure. So it's implicit inside of it. It's folded up inside of it.